Hey everyone, tonight we will step into a story that is both unforgettable and most easily misunderstood. A story about beauty, betrayal and transformation. Her name has become a synonym for terror. Her gaze can turn life itself into cold stone, and her tragedy still whispers in the ruins of time. Her name is Medusa. But tonight, we won't tell you the rumors you think you know. We are stripping away 3,000 years of repetition, distortion and deliberate accusation to reveal the truth that ancient poets have attempted to bury. The story of a devout priestess being violated, a cursed victim, and a monster created by God himself. So before we start this myth and the decline of memory, if you enjoy exploring the hidden sides of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Comfort History to learn more about the long journey of the past. Tell me in the comments where you are listening and when you are there. When the outside world is quiet and the shadows start to move, being immersed in such a story almost has a poetic quality. Dim the light or light a candle. Take a deep breath and let's step into the ancient world together. Tonight we're not just talking about myth. We are uncovering the truth buried beneath the stones, silence and fear. This is the entire story of Medusa. The story doesn't begin with a monster, but with a young woman who believes that the gods will protect her. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece. It's not a marble white tourist postcard or a Hollywood epic version, but the genuine one. The air was filled with the aroma of incense and olive oil, the sound of feet in sandals stepping on worn minus-out stones. The voice speaking in a dialect that had vanished for thousands of years kept making noises. This was the golden age of Athens. Around the 5th century BC, when the Parthenon was still shining, the goddess Athena was not merely a myth. She is real, exists, and is a sacred force that shapes the daily life of every person who walks through her sacred city. In this world lived a young woman named Medusa. The first thing you need to know about her story is she is very beautiful, not just attractive, so beautiful that it can make people stop talking, turn their heads to stare, inspire poets and artists, and perhaps even some wealthy Athenian fathers would propose to them, striving for favorable marriages for their sons. But Medusa was not interested in marriage. She was not interested in the traditional life of most young women at that time. Her short childhood, arranged marriage, raising children, managing the household, while her husband was responsible for the real affairs in the world. No. Medusa chose a completely different path. She chose to serve Athena. This is not a decision made easily. Becoming the priestess of Athena meant wearing to remain chaste for a lifetime. This means that she devotes herself entirely to the service of the goddess, spending every day in rituals, taking care of the sacred flame, looking after the temple, maintaining the complex network of rituals, and connecting the sacred world with the mortal world. Why would a beautiful young woman choose such a life? In a world where women have almost no independent choices, clergy offers something rare minus autonomy. The priestess of Athena held true power, true respect and true authority. She can own property, make decisions and speak on public forums. She's protected by the goddess, which means she is basically not influenced by the laws and customs of mortals. Medusa's beauty did not fade from the people around her, but it was a kind of sacred beauty, a sacred beauty that belonged to no one but to the goddess. She walked through Athens with her head held high, her hair meticulously styled in a complex way that matched her status, flowing around her like water. People noticed her and whispered about her, but they also respected her. She was Athena's favorite, Athena's priestess. Of course, ironically, this is astonishing. This woman, who later became the most terrifying monster in Greek mythology, might have been the most protected woman in the entire Athens at the beginning. She lived in the sacred area of the Parthenon, surrounded by other priestesses, under the direct guardianship of the city's patron saint. If there was anyone in ancient Athens who was safe, it would undoubtedly be Medusa. But we will find that security is often an illusion, and the gods, as humans have come to realize time and again, are not always the guardians we hope for. Medusa's daily life should follow the rhythm of the ancient temple rituals. She got up before dawn to take care of the sacred flame that had been burning continuously in memory of Athena. She took part in the morning sacrificial offering, poured wine and oil on the altar, and recited the prayers passed down from generations of priests at the same time. She helped prepare the elaborate sacrifices to celebrate the holy day, assisted the pilgrims who came to seek the grace of the goddess, and maintained the sacred objects kept in the inner chambers of the temple. Her priestly companions are her family members, her sisters. They ate together, told stories together, and enjoyed the peaceful satisfaction brought by the purpose of life and dedication together. Medusa was respected by them, and they might even envy her for her beauty. For the beauty that served the goddess was regarded as a gift that could enhance the honor of the entire temple. She will learn to read and write, skills that were not common among women of her time. She studied sacred texts, memorized the complex genealogies of gods and heroes, and became an expert in the intricate protocols governing sacred worship. Her mind is as cultivated as her appearance. This is the reason why her story is so tragic. Medusa chose this kind of life. She was not forced to go to the temple for worship because of poverty or family responsibilities. She came to the temple of Athena as a voluntary supplicant, attracted by the sincere dedication and the commitment to a life of direct service to the gods. With the enthusiasm of a young person, she believed that devoting herself to Athena would protect her, guide her, and give meaning to her life. She believes that the goddess will protect her safety. This belief, as beautiful and innocent as Medusa's, is about to be shattered in the cruelest way. But before we reach that dark turning point, we need to understand the world where Medusa lived, the sacred space she called home, and the goddess she devoted herself to unwaveringly. To understand why her transformation was so devastating, we first need to know what she lost. Her temple of Athena is not merely a building. This is the heart of Athens' religious and political life, where the world of mortals and the world of gods converge every day. For a young priestess like Medusa, it is the center of the universe. The Parthenon rises from the Acropolis of Athens, like a marble prayer frozen in stone, with its columns reaching towards the sky in perfect mathematical harmony. That in Medusa's time, this place was not the weather-beaten tourist attraction we know today. This is a living temple brimming with colors, sounds, and constant activities. Marble is not pure white, but is painted with bright blue, red, and gold. The huge copper door sparkled in the Mediterranean sun, and the air around the temple was filled with the sounds of prayers, offerings, and the daily worship of the deities. Inside the temple stands a huge statue of Athena Portonis, 40 feet tall, covered with gold and ivory. The goddess stood there, wearing a helmet and a shield. On her outstretched palm was a small statue of Nike, the goddess of victory. This is not merely a statue. For the ancient Greeks, this was Athena herself, guarding her city and people. For Medusa, this statue was the focus of her entire existence. She begins each day with parent sacrifice, and ends each day in the same way. When she was performing her duties, the goddess's carved eyes seemed to follow her all the time, constantly reminding her that she was never alone, never unnoticed, and never unprotected. The temple complex was extremely large, not only including the main sanctuary, but also the living quarters of the priestesses, storage rooms for sacred objects, kitchens for preparing ritual meals, and workshops for making exquisite textiles and items used in sacrificial ceremonies. Medusa lives here, works here, and finds her identity and purpose here. Her responsibilities are complex and diverse. As one of the high priestesses, she is responsible for maintaining the sacred flame that keeps burning for the honor of Athena. This fire will never go out. It has been burning for generations, and has been continuously cared for by a group of dedicated women. The responsibility is huge. If the fire goes out during her duty, it will be regarded as a disastrous omen, indicating that the goddess has withdrawn her favor from the city. She also participated in elaborately designed religious festivals. The Panettone, held every 4 years, is the most important one among them. For several consecutive days, the entire city will hold parades, sacrifices, sports competitions, and present a new robe to the goddess to celebrate Athena. Medusa will play a central role in these celebrations, helping to organize the ceremonies, prepare the offerings, and maintain the sacred agreements to ensure that everything proceeds in accordance with God's will. But her most important duty, and the one that ultimately led to her downfall, was to maintain the purity of the temple. Athena was a virgin goddess, and her temple was a secluded space, free from anything that might contaminate her sacred essence. The priestess who served her must also maintain her physical and mental purity. They cannot get married, cannot have sexual relations, and cannot even have the idea of romantic love without breaking the sacred vow. This is not a difficulty but a privilege. Being chosen to undertake such work means going beyond the ordinary concerns of human life. The priestess is respected, honored and protected. They held real power in Athenian society, offered advice on state affairs, interpreted omens, and acted as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Medusa fully accepted this role. She is renowned for her piety, dedication and unwavering commitment to the goddess. All the other priestesses respected her very much. The young women in Athens regarded her as a role model, and even the most powerful men in Athens held her in high regard. The temple was her world and she was very content there. She found her purpose, identity and sense of security in serving Athena. She firmly believes that she is protected by the goddess. After all, what could hurt a person who devotes his entire life to God? The daily rhythm of the temple can be predicted just like the rising and setting of the sun. At dawn, people began their morning prayers and lit the sacred flame. On this day, pilgrims seek the blessings of the goddess. Officials consult on national affairs and the ongoing work of maintaining the sacred space. The evening brought more prayers and more offerings. She was calmly content with another day of life, serving a cause greater than her own. Medusa's priestly companions were her closest companions. They share everything, eat, pray, rejoice, grieve, and their sense of mission to dedicate together. What binds them together is not only their vows, but also sincere love and mutual respect. This temple is more than just a workplace. This is a community, a family, and a true refuge. And at the center of all this was Athena herself, wise, powerful, and protective. She was the goddess who grew from Zeus' head. She bestowed an olive tree upon Athens and was renowned for her justice, strategic thinking, and strict protection of those who served her loyally. Medusa absolutely believes in this kind of protection. She devoted her life to Athena. In return, she hoped that the goddess would protect her, shield her from harm, and respect the loyalty she had shown. This belief is about to undergo the cruelest test, because the gods, as mortals have learned time and again, have their own priorities, their own conflicts, their own blindness, and sometimes innocent people become the victims of the sacred politics they have never understood. When Medusa was performing her duties in the temple, it seemed like another ordinary day. She had no idea that one of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon had noticed her beauty and decided to possess it. She had no idea that her life was about to be destroyed by a devastating crime, which would not only change her body, but also alter the essence of her existence. She was Athena's priestess, Athena's lover, and Athena's favorite. She believes this means she is safe. She will soon realize how far off the mark she has been. The sea god did not announce his arrival. There is no trumpet, no declaration of God. There was no low warning from the prophetic bird. Poseidon arrived at the temple of Athena like a storm surge, suddenly and with great destructive power, instantly turning the sacred space into a crime scene. We need to understand what this meant in the context of ancient Greek religion and society. Poseidon is no ordinary god. He is one of the big three, the brother of Zeus and Hades, the ruler of the seas surrounding the Greek world. His power is immense, his temper is legendary, and his appetite for ordinary women is recorded in countless myths and stories. When Poseidon wanted something, he would take it. The concept of consent is seldom considered by the gods. This is no ordinary temple. Medusa is no ordinary woman. This is the most sacred place of Athena. She was Athena's loyal priestess. The upcoming infringement is not merely a crime against Medusa. This is a desecration of the universe and a direct attack on the authority and dignity of another major god. It is disheartening that ancient sources are vague about the exact details of what happened. Perhaps it is because crime is so terrifying that even myths cannot directly describe it. What we know is, Poseidon entered Athena's temple and found Medusa alone. He sexually assaulted her. The brutality of this behavior is exacerbated by its location. This is not merely rape. This was a rape that took place in the most sacred part of Athens, a desecration that defiled the core of the city's religious life. Imagine Medusa's fear. She's a young woman who has been serving God all her life. God absolutely believes in their justice and protection. She vowed to remain chaste, not only to Athena but also was a fundamental component of her priestly identity. Her purity is not just personal, it is sacred and crucial to her ability to serve the goddess. And now, one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon is destroying all of this with an unintentional brutality. She couldn't defeat him. He is immortal, sacred, and far more powerful than any mortal. She couldn't call for help. Who dares to interfere in God's affairs? She can't even run. The temple that was once her refuge has now become her prison. The attack itself was painful enough, but the location made the situation even worse. Poseidon not only raped Medusa, he raped Athena before her statue, right in front of the goddess she served. Its symbolic meaning is beyond doubt. This was Poseidon exercising his power not only to a mortal woman, but also to his niece, sending a message that even the most sacred place of Athena was not out of reach for him. After the war ended, Poseidon left. God will not bear the consequences of their actions, will not apologize to their victims, and will not admit the damage they have left behind. He returned to his underwater palace, perhaps not thinking much about it, just like a person stepping on an ant. And Medusa was left behind, tattered and defiled in the sacred space that had once been her entire world. Physical trauma is just the beginning. She was violated not only as a woman but also as a priestess. She broke the sacred oath, and it was not her own fault. Her purity, which was crucial to the role she played in the temple, was destroyed by sacred violence. Worse still, she was trapped in an impossible position. In ancient Greek society, rape victims were often blamed for their own violations, especially if they were alone or in a situation that might be regarded as improper. But Medusa did nothing wrong. Under the protection of the goddess she served, she has always been where she should be, doing what she should do. What about the goddess? Where was Athena during the attack? The ancient Greeks believed that their gods were omnipresent in their temples and constantly knew what was happening in their sacred spaces. Did Athena see anything happen to her priestess? Did she see her uncle desecrating her temple and her faithful servants? Those problems that must have tormented Medusa afterwards are heartbreaking. Could it be that she has let the goddess down? Did she do something she deserved? Is this a punishment for some unknown sin? Or is it that the goddess simply doesn't care about protecting her? The psychological trauma caused by sexual assault is devastating in any case. But for a woman whose entire identity is built on her sacred purity and sacred protection, such an attack is destroying her soul. Everything she believed in minus about herself, about God, about the essence of divine justice minus was shattered in a violent act. Her loneliness is something few people can imagine. She couldn't tell her priestly companion. The shame and defilement she felt would make her an abandoned person. She cannot seek justice through the human court. Who would believe that God would commit such a crime? Even if a lawsuit is filed, who would still dare to sue him? She couldn't even ask for comfort from the goddess she served. That goddess is either unable to protect her or chooses not to protect her. Ancient documents did not elaborate on Medusa's emotional state after the attack, but we can imagine the extent of her despair. She gave everything to Athena, but at the moment when she needed it most, this dedication offered her no protection at all. She was trapped in the temple where she had been violated, forced to continue performing her duties as if nothing had happened, as if her world had not been completely destroyed. A few days have passed, perhaps several weeks. Medusa struggled to maintain her normal appearance and continue her sacred duty. While her heart was dying, she guarded the sacred flame with trembling hands. She prayed to the goddess who failed to protect her. She leads a life that has no meaning at all. Then Athena returned to her temple. The goddess discovered that her sacred space had been defiled and her priestess had been violated. Her reaction would determine Medusa's fate. In a just world, Athena would comfort her loyal servant, punish Poseidon for his crimes and restore the sanctity of the temple. Medusa did nothing wrong. She is the victim, not the perpetrator. But the gods, as mortals have learned time and again, are not bound by the concepts of human justice or compassion. Athena's reaction to the violation of her temple and her priestess was almost as devastating as the initial crime, because Athena did not protect her victim but chose to punish her. When Athena discovered what was happening in the temple, she immediately flew into a rage. However, this cruel and suffocating anger was not directed at her uncle Poseidon, the god who committed this crime. On the contrary, it struck Medusa like a bolt from the blue, and this victim had already suffered a pain that no ordinary person could bear. The subsequent transformation has become a legend, but the real psychological fear that occurred in Medusa often vanished in dramatic retelling. This is not merely a magical transformation, or a simple curse. This was a systematic destruction that wiped out everything that made Medusa. And all of this was accomplished by the goddess she was unwavered to. Imagine this scene. Medusa, already crushed by trauma and despair, suddenly found herself face to face with Athena, the goddess she worshipped, the sacred protector she trusted all her life. Finally came. For a moment, Medusa might have felt a glimmer of hope. Athena will surely understand. She will surely offer me comfort, justice and protection. On the contrary, Athena's eyes sparkled with anger, and her voice was as cold as a winter stone. "You have defiled my temple," said the goddess. "No, my temple is defiled, or you have been wronged in my temple." Blame, responsibility and guilt all fell entirely on Medusa's shoulders. The victim was held accountable for the crime committed against her. The transformation began immediately. Medusa's beautiful hair, which she had always styled in a delicate style that matched the high priestess, began to twist and change. Each thread has thickened and lengthened, transforming into a living, meandering thing. Before long, the crown on her head was no longer shiny hair, but a group of hissing snakes. Their scales sparkled with unnatural colors, and their eyes shone with vicious wisdom. That the snake is just the beginning. Medusa's face was once so beautiful that it stopped talking and inspired poetry, but now it has become a terrifying thing. Her skin became roughened, covered with scales. Her teeth have turned into fangs. Her tongue was forked like a snake. Her eyes, once shining with wisdom and loyalty, have turned into tools of death. Anyone who looks directly at them will immediately turn to stone. Her body also changed. Some materials describe her ever-minus growing wings, bronze in color and terrifying, which indicates that she is a monster rather than a blessed person. Her hands turned into claws. Her voice turned into a scream, enough to drive ordinary people crazy. The physical changes are devastating, but the psychological impact is infinitely bad. Athena not only changed Medusa's appearance, she's erasing her own identity. This beautiful priestess, who had served the gods all her life, was becoming the thing she feared the most. An monster that threatens all sacred things. The cruelest irony is that it is precisely this gaze that turns others into stones, that means Medusa can no longer look at other creatures. She was destined to be completely isolated, cursed to have all contact with humans cut off, and this curse made her existence fatal. This woman was surrounded by priestesses who had found their identities and goals in the community, but now she was destined to be lonely forever. Athena defended this terrifying punishment, revealing the distorted logic of divine justice in the ancient world. The goddess claimed that Medusa allowed herself to be violated in the temple, and her appearance defiled the sacred space. No matter where Medusa was, she was doing what she was supposed to do. Don't mind that she doesn't have the ability to resist God. Don't mind that she is a victim of violent crime. In Athena's eyes, Medusa's purity was destroyed. A priestess without purity was a detestable thing and must be eradicated from civilized society. The fact that impurity was imposed on her has nothing to do with this. The fact that she did nothing wrong is irrelevant to this. She has become an unclean thing, so she must be punished. But Athena's reaction had another layer, which made it even more chilling. Some scholars believe that the goddess was actually punishing Medusa, not because she was violated, but because she was beautiful enough to catch Poseidon's attention from the very beginning. In this interpretation, Medusa's beauty itself was regarded as a sin, a dangerous weapon that disrupts the peace of the temple and attracts unnecessary attention from the gods. By modern standards, this victim mentality is terrifying, but it was very common and disturbing in ancient society. Women are often regarded as being responsible for violent acts against them, especially if they are considered beautiful or desirable. This kind of logic is circular and cruel. If a woman is violated, she must have done something to stir up trouble. Therefore, no matter what happens next, she deserves it. The Athena's transformation of Medusa can also be interpreted as a sacred political act. As a goddess, Athena could not confront Poseidon directly, otherwise it might trigger a war among the gods of Mount Olympus. Punishing an ordinary person, even an innocent one, is much safer and easier. Medusa became a scapegoat, to sacrifice the justice of the world for the sake of maintaining the harmony of the gods. This transformation itself was designed to be as psychologically devastating as possible. Medusa is not just ugly, she has become the opposite of everything in the past. She once brought beauty and tranquility to the temple, but now she brings terror and death. She was once a passage between mortals and gods, but now she has become a warning of what will happen to those who somehow angered at the gods and the snake that replaced her hair. In Greek culture, the snake is a symbol of wisdom and renewal, and is a creature associated with the earth goddess and female power. By transforming Medusa's hair into a snake, Athena corrupted these symbols, turning them into tools of terror rather than modes of wisdom. The ability to turn others into stone might be the cruelest aspect of a curse. This ensured that Medusa could no longer experience human contact, could no longer feel the comfort of companionship and the warmth of being touched by others. She was destined to be cut off from the world forever, surrounded by stone statues of those who had unfortunately seen her. With the transformation completed, Medusa found herself no longer popular in the temple that had once been her home. She was driven into the wilderness, exiled by the only world she knew well. The other priestesses, her sisters, could no longer bear to look at her. Those pilgrims who once sought her blessings now scatter in all directions in terror upon hearing the news of her presence. She transformed from a victim to a monster, from a beloved priestess to a terrifying abandoned child, and from a servant protected by the gods to an enemy of all human lives. All of this was because of beauty, loneliness, and when a god decided to commit violent acts, she stood in the wrong place. This woman, who once absolutely believed in God's justice, has now become living evidence that such justice is often nothing but a comforting illusion. Medusa's transformation was complete, but her real torment was just beginning, because now she has to learn to live like a monster in a world that will never show her mercy. Being exiled from Athens was not a journey, but an escape. Medusa fled the city that had once been her home, the temple that had once been her refuge, and the life that had given her purpose and identity. Behind her lies everything she knows or has loved. Ahead lies only the unknown wilderness and the terrifying weight of her transformation. Where will a monster go when she is expelled from the civilized world? For Medusa, the answer is to stay as far away from human settlements as possible. Ancient legends place her final refuge at the edge of the known world, on a desolate land where the air seems to be filled with fear and the sun finds it hard to penetrate the continuous mist. Some records describe her journey to the distant west coast of Africa, beyond the Pillars at Hercules, in a realm where normal geographical rules and reality seem to have been set aside. Others placed her on a mysterious island in the unknown waters of the Mediterranean Sea, a place that exists more in legends than on maps. This trip itself must have been a nightmare. Medusa could no longer look directly at any living being without killing it, which meant she had to travel with her eyes down or covered, relying on sound and instinct rather than vision to navigate. Every encounter with another traveler ends in tragedy. Every time I catch a glimpse of her reflection in water or polished metal, it reminds me of what she has become. She couldn't seek refuge in an inn or a tavern. Her appearance would turn them into tombs full of stone statues. She can't afford food or daily necessities. The merchants were all stunned when they saw her face. She was forced to scavenge, steal from the dead and survive on anything she found in the wilderness. She is always alone. This psychological impact of isolation cannot be overemphasized. Humans are by nature social animals, and Medusa is no exception. She thrived in the temple community and found her identity and purpose in her relationships with other priestesses and worshippers. Now she is destined to lead an eerily crazy life of loneliness. She eventually declared that the scenery belonging to her territory was as desolate as her new life. Ancient writers described it as a place that is always at dusk, where the sun seems not to dare to shine too brightly on the stones, seemed to be whispering in a vicious voice. The air was thick and stuffy, filled with an unnatural silence. It was more like death than calmness. On this abandoned land, Medusa established her home. It is not a home in any recognizable sense, but a nest, a hiding place, a refuge where she can survive without accidentally destroying innocent lives. The descriptions that have been passed down depict a scene of almost unbearable desolation. A cave or a ruined building, surrounded by stone statues of those who had unfortunately met her. These statues are not decorative arts, but monuments to tragedy. Everyone was once a living person, a lost traveler who strayed into his own territory, a hero who hunted famous monsters for glory, the sailor who was blown off course by a storm. In the final moments of their lives, they stood motionless, their faces distorted by fear or surprise. This is an eternal testimony to the lethal power that Medusa could not control. She lives among these accidental victims, and these stones bear witness to her accursed existence. Imagine the psychological cost of being constantly surrounded by evidence of death you have caused, even if these deaths were not intentional. Each statue reminds her of what kind of person she has become. Every cold face and the accusations she could never answer. The basic necessities for survival have turned into huge challenges. When your gaze kills you, how do you look for food? How do you collect water when you can't see a stream or a pond? How do you stay rational when every interaction with the real world ends in death? Medusa came up with some strategies in a desperate situation. She learned to move around the world with her eyes closed or covered, relying on other senses to navigate. She learned to hunt at night because most of the animals were asleep and unlikely to see her face. She learned to talk to the statues around her and have conversations with the stone remains of the victims in order to maintain a connection with language and thought. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of her life was that she realized what she had lost. She remembered that she was beautiful, loved and welcomed wherever she went. She recalled the warmth of human friendship, the satisfaction brought by meaningful work, and the sense of security that she believed she was protected by the power of God. Those memories have now become a source of torment rather than comfort, reminding one of a life that can never be retrieved. This transformation did not weaken her intelligence, nor erase her emotional ability. Her mind and soul are both complete human, trapped in the body of a monster and unable to live a normal life. She could think, feel, remember, hope and despair as strongly as before, but she could no longer act on these emotions without causing death and destruction. Sleep, when it comes, offers no escape. Her dreams were filled with memories of her past life, illusions of the temples she had served, and the faces of the priestesses who had been by her side. She would wake up from these dreams and find herself once again exiled to a desolate place, surrounded by stone statues and overwhelmed by the weight of isolation, unable to breathe. Time itself becomes meaningless in this existence. Day and night blend together, seasons pass by imperceptibly, and years accumulate aimlessly and without progress. Medusa exists rather than lives, endures rather than thrives. Spiritually and emotionally, she is dead to this world, but biologically still exists. However, she persisted. There is something about her that refuses to completely yield to despair. Some of the sparks that once shone within her will never fade away. Perhaps it is hoped that one day the curse will be lifted. Perhaps this was just simple stubbornness, refusing to let the gods be satisfied to see her completely destroyed. For something deeper, a realization that even in her monster state, she's essentially still herself. It is still worth existing, even if such existence has become a torment. But Medusa was not the only one who was exiled. Her transformation is not unique. She became one of the three sisters, the Gomba sisters, united among the monsters and bound together by their shared pain. Their story added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating tale. In the ancient world, tragedies often multiplied rather than were shared. When the gods decide to punish people, they seldom confine their anger to a single victim. Therefore, Medusa's transformation into a monster was not a single curse, but part of a greater divine punishment that created three, rather than one Gordon. Her two younger sisters, Stano and Yuri, have committed no crime except for the accidental birth that made them Medusa's siblings. They were all beautiful young women, living their own lives and pursuing their own paths. However, the wrath of God swept over them like a plague, turning them into monsters. The reason was simple: they shared the same bloodline as those who had offended the gods. It is disheartening that ancient sources provide vague information about the lives of Theo and Yuri before their transformation. Are they also priestesses? Are they married women with their own families? Are they little girls who have just stepped out of their childhood? We don't know. Perhaps this uncertainty itself is part of the tragedy. In the story of Medusa, they have become footnotes. Her personal identities were erased by the strange forms they were forced to take. What we know is that their transformation is almost similar to Medusa in every detail. They were also given snake-like hair, twisted and emitting vicious hissing sounds. They also grew bronze wings, which marked that they were creatures of air and darkness, not of earth and light. They also have innate sharp claws, fangs and voices that can doctor ordinary people crazy out of fear. But there is a key difference. Theo and Yuri became immortals. Although Medusa was transformed, she still maintained her mortal nature, while her sisters worked theirs to live forever in their distorted forms. This is not kindness, but the most exquisite cruelty one can imagine. Medusa still has the possibility of death at least. I hope her pain will come to an end one day. Her sisters did not have such comfort. Just imagine how terrifying their situation is. They are destined to remain monsters forever, watching the world around them change, while they themselves are frozen in a cursed fall. They will witness the rise and fall of civilizations, the life and death of countless generations, the birth and death of languages, religions and the entire way of life, and they cannot participate in it, except as objects of terror. The three sisters found each other on that desolate wasteland at the edge of the world. The common monster that separated them from other creatures gathered them together. Their reunion, if it can be called a reunion, is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, they are no longer completely alone. They have each other, companions who understand their pain, and sisters who watch them not turn into stones. But their reunion also constantly reminds them of what they have lost. They looked at each other, but what they saw was not comfort but their own ugly sides. Each sister's face is like a mirror, transforming them into a certain form. They can't forget, can't deny, and can't hope that perhaps this transformation won't be as thorough as they feared. Their relationship became complicated by eternal life and inevitable death. I know and Yuri knew they would have to watch Medusa grow old and eventually die, which added to their already unbearable pain the expectation of loss. Meanwhile, Medusa was confronted with the reality that her death would make her sisters even more lonely. However, despite these complex circumstances, the sisters established a bond that transcended their monster nature. They developed their own gestures and vocal language, as well as a way of communication that doesn't require direct eye contact with each other. They shared the meager food they had collected on the wasteland. Hidden the limitations of their existence, they comforted each other as much as possible. A name Steno implies strength, becoming the fierce guardian of this small family. She is the most aggressive of the three and attacks any intruder who intrudes into her territory the fastest. Her immortality gave birth to a kind of reckless courage. What could be the worst case scenario for someone who won't die? Uriel wandered around and was the most restless of the sisters. Sometimes she would disappear for days or weeks, exploring the deepest parts of desolate lands, or venturing to the fringes of the civilized world. Perhaps she hopes to find some ways to break free from their curse. Perhaps movement is merely a way for her to cope with the heavy burden of being imprisoned in the body of a monster, and Medusa remained the most human among three. With a tenacity that was both admirable and heart-wrenching, she persisted in her memory of her past life. She would tell her sisters about the temple, the ceremonies they held and the goddesses they served. She tried to maintain the appearance of some prayers and rituals that once gave her life meaning, even though those gods had abandoned her. My sister's daily life is about learning and adapting to an impossible environment. They learned to hunt together, using their combined abilities to trap prey without accidentally petrifying it. They learned to communicate through touch and sound, developing an intimate relationship that was deeper and more limited than normal interpersonal relationships. They have also learned to protect themselves. A legend of the Gordon with snake hair spread throughout the ancient world, but their remote geographical location did not protect them from tourists. Pharaohs in pursuit of glory, treasure hunters drawn by the legend of wealth, and soldiers fleeing the battlefield. All kinds of humans have found their way to the edge of the world, and most of them have violent thoughts. The stone statues around their nests are not only an accident but also a warning. Every person who was frozen told the same story. This is the fate of those who come here with hostility. However, these warnings are seldom taken seriously. In the ancient world, many people believed that they were smart enough, strong enough, and lucky enough to succeed where others failed. The two sisters came up with a strategy to deal with these invaders. They learned to work together with their frightened lethal gaze as collaborative weapons. They might suddenly appear from different directions and overwhelm the enemy before they can react. Their appearance is often enough to drive attackers crazy out of fear and make actual battles unnecessary. But every successful defense has increased their sense of guilt and isolation. They are not born violent animals. They were forced to turn into monsters, and now they are forced to play the role of monsters again. Every death they cause, even in self-defense, is another link in the chain that binds them to their cursed existence. The relationship between the sisters also becomes complicated because they all know what has led to their transformation. They all knew that Medusa was the initial target of God's wrath, and their own pain was essentially a collateral damage to a conflict that they had not initiated and could not understand. This kind of understanding might breed resentment, but it seems to have strengthened their connection. They are all victims of the same God's arbitrary cruelty. Years passed like this. Decades later, the two sisters aged at different rates. Medusa showed the effects of time, while Theo and Yuri remained frozen in their terrifying youth. The world beyond the wasteland was constantly changing and evolving, but only when a few humans who encountered them whispered in terror did news reach them that they had survived and escaped. They heard stories of wars and conquests, the rise and fall of kings, and tales of new gods and heroes. They know that their own legends are growing, and they have become mythological and terrifying figures used to scare children and warn travelers. They have become larger than life, more like symbols rather than reality. However, as they are about to learn, symbols have a way to attract the attention of heroes. Heroes, unlike ordinary mortals, are not here to escape or hide, but to test themselves against the legendary things. The peaceful years of exile and adaptation are coming to an end. A young man named Perseus is about to embark on an exploration journey that will take him to the edge of the world. Armed with sacred weapons and the determination of a hero, he is coming to kill Medusa. His arrival will shatter the fragile things that the sisters have built in the kingdom of stones and shadows. The most famous chapter of Medusa's story is about to begin, but this is also her last chapter. Every hero needs an impossible mission, and every impossible mission requires a monster. When the gods decided to test a young man named Perseus, they chose the most terrifying creature on their vast list of nightmares minus Medusa, whose gaze could turn a living person into sand. But Perseus' pursuit was not driven by lofty aspirations or sacred calls. It emerges in the chaotic reality of secular politics, family farces, and that kind of foolish self-praise that seems to torment young people of all cultures and centuries. To understand why Perseus found himself daring to kill one of the most dangerous creatures in the ancient world, we need to understand the relationships and competitive web that brought him to the desolate coast where the Gorgos settled. Perseus was the son of Denes, the princess of Argos, and Zeus, which he was imprisoned by her father in a bronze tower. Zeus visited her in the form of a golden rain. Yes, even by the standards of Greek mythology, this statement is rather strange. Daniela's father, Actius, locked her up because an oracle had foretold that her son would kill her. The imprisonment was to prevent her from having a child. But Zeus, as usual, found a way to avoid a fatal precaution. When Perseus was born, Ax was faced with a dilemma. He couldn't allow himself to kill his daughter and grants indirectly, but considering the prophecy, he couldn't afford to keep them by his side either. His solution is typically Greek, combining pragmatism and cowardice. He locked his mother and son in a wooden box and threw it into the sea, entrusting their fate to the gods. This box was washed up on the island of Solobos, where it was discovered by a fisherman named Titus. This kind person took in the refugee mother and son and raised Perseus as his own son. They lived quietly on the island for several years. Dani was a weaver, while Perseus grew into a strong and intelligent young man, knowing nothing about his sacred legacy. When Perseus came of age, his peaceful life came to an end and he caught the attention of King Polyxd of Serapos. Polites wanted to keep Denis for himself, but he knew that Perseus would never allow his mother to be forced to marry someone else. If possible, the king needs to get rid of this young man forever. But Polyethylene is very cunning. He announced his intention to marry a different woman and demanded wedding gifts from all the nobles of his kingdom. Everyone has to contribute a horse, which is a considerable expense and shows their loyalty and status. Perseus was very poor and had no mark to give away, which made him subject to public ridicule and humiliation. In such humiliation, Perseus rashly made a statement that heroes excel at and that wise men avoid throughout their lives. He claimed that he could bring the king any wedding gift he wanted, even Medusa's own head. As soon as these words came out of his mouth, Perseus realized that he had made a disastrous mistake. Polydeutes accepted the proposal at once, and satisfaction shone in his eyes. He managed to put the young man in an awkward situation. Perseus would either die to fulfill his boast, leaving Day unprotected, or he would fail even in his attempts, turning himself into a coward and losing all his social status. What Perseus didn't know was that his sacred legacy was about to manifest itself in ways beyond his imagination. It seems that the gods' arrangement for him goes far beyond the trivial politics of a small island nation. The first signal came from Athena herself, the goddess who turned Medusa into a monster. Ancient storytellers did not overlook this irony, although they seldom commented directly. The goddess who once punished herself for sexually assaulting victims now seems to have helped a young hero who wants to kill the same victim. Athena provided assistance in the form of information and equipment. She told Perseus where to find the organ, warned him of the lethal nature of Medusa's gaze, and provided him with a polished bronze shield that could be used as a mirror. By looking at Medusa's reflection, instead of directly at her, Perseus can approach her without turning into stone. But Athena's help was conditional and warned. She emphasized that Perseus could only kill Medusa, not her immortal sisters. She also emphasized that even after death, the head must be handled with great care because its petrified ability will remain unchanged. This is not a hunting expedition. This is a surgical blow that requires precision, courage and a bit of luck. The goddess also instructed Perseus to seek additional divine assistance. The Georgian people are no ordinary monsters. Defeating them requires more than just the weapons and courage of ordinary people. He needs tools made by the gods themselves. Perseus' next stop was to visit Hermes, who was the messenger god and the guide of heroes. Hermes gave him a pair of sandals with wings, enabling him to fly. He was given a sword made of hard stone that could pierce through anything. It also gave him the direction to find the goddess Hesperate, who guards the treasure at the western end of the world. Hesperate possesses two important items that Perseus needs: an invisible hat borrowed from Hades and a magic bag called De Grib Acis, which can safely hold the Medusa's severed head, and the person carrying it will not be affected by its power. At obtaining these props is itself a task within a task. The goddesses will not give up on them easily. The creatures and challenges that protect them will test Perseus' value as a hero. Before the fairies entrusted him with such a powerful artifact, he had to prove himself through tests of strength, cunning and moral character. The invisible hat is particularly important for his mission. The Georgian people are not solitary creatures but sisters who work together to defend their territory. Perseus needed to approach Medusa without alerting Theo and Uriel, and invisibility was his only chance to catch him off guard. When Perseus collected his sacred equipment and was preparing for his journey to the edge of the world, he must have experienced complex emotions, of course, including fear. He's going to try something that no ordinary person can escape. He was also excited about attaining eternal glory in the future and proving that he was worthy of his sacred legacy, but there may also be suspicion, or even guilt. The stories he had heard about Medusa depicted her as a monster, a purely evil creature that threatened the lives of all civilizations. But Perseus was very smart. He wanted to know the origin of this monster. Has Medusa always been evil? Or has she been transformed into something terrifying by a force beyond her control? These questions, if he could think of them, were all academic. Perseus boasted in front of the entire Serip's court. His honor, his mother's safety, and his own life all depend on whether he can successfully complete this exploration, no matter what Medusa was once. She is now the key to his survival and the future of his family. This young hero set out from Serapos, armed with sacred weapons, supernatural abilities and the blessings of the gods. Like any ordinary person, he was fully prepared for his mission. What he didn't expect was that when he finally reached the lair of the snake-haired female monster, he would encounter complex emotions, because the monster he planned to kill was once very similar to him. A young man who tried to serve God faithfully got entangled in the politics of God that they could neither understand nor control, and was eventually punished for the crimes they had not committed. The similarities between Hirazan monsters are about to become tragically clear. The journey to the edge of the world is not a leisurely voyage, but a painful adventure, entering regions where normal geographical rules and realities are beginning to collapse. Perseus set out from Serapos with his sacred armory. All he knew was that he was heading west towards the waters where the sun was setting, a place that few had crossed and even fewer had returned from. The winged sandals that Hermes gave him were not only a convenient means of transportation, but also a tool of divine power, enabling him to soar like a god over the wine and darkness of the Mediterranean Sea. Below him, the familiar islands of the Greek archipelago turned into strange waters. Sea monsters emerged from the sea surface, and storms appeared and vanished without warning. Flight itself is a kind of enlightenment. Perseus was closely connected to the earth throughout his life, walking on familiar land with human footsteps. Now he can travel a long distance within a few hours, observe the curves of the earth beneath his feet, and see and form patterns that observers on land cannot appreciate. It is both intoxicating and terrifying, but this journey is not without danger. The further west he went, the more unstable the boundary between the human world and the divine realm became. Wherever he passed, the air itself seemed to be filled with magic. There, the appearance and disappearance of the islands depended on the mental state he observer. There, the concept of direction became uncertain and unreliable. Perseus learned to navigate through traditional landmarks. He follows the guidance of stars that emit light in ways unknown to astronomers on Earth. He observed all kinds of signs and omens to see if there were any indications that he was approaching the kingdom of the snake girl. Flocks of birds flying in unnatural formations, the shadows cast by the clouds darker than any natural weather, the air becoming increasingly silent, or indicating that he was approaching something that even nature dared not disturb. The mental challenges during the journey are as difficult as the physical ones. Perseus was almost flying towards death, carrying untested weapons and abilities that had never been used in actual combat. The weight of his mission was like a physical burden pressing down on him. With every mile he walked, he was 1 mile closer to the moment when he had to face the most terrifying creature in his imagination. During the long flight, he had time to think, but his thoughts were not always comfortable. The story he heard about Medusa was full of contradictions and loopholes. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. Some legends depict her as an ancient demon that has always existed and threatened the lives of ordinary people. Others, however, believe that she was once someone else, someone who was changed, rather than being born a monster. The problem that troubles him is simple yet profound. What right does he have to kill her? Perseus embarked on this journey not to protect the innocent nor to uphold justice, but to fulfill the proud promise he made in his youth. He intends to kill a guy who, as far as he knows, has never hurt him or anyone he cares about. But these moral complexities are masked by practical needs. Perseus had already decided to take this path. There was no glorious way back. His mother's safety depends on his success. If he returns empty-handed, his own reputation will be ruined in an instant. Whether right or wrong, he must persevere to the end. As he approached the edge of the known world, the scenery beneath his feet began to undergo disturbing changes. The azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea gradually dimmed, becoming darker and more ominous. A sea that did not reflect light and seemed to have absorbed the sun's own radiance. Nameless islands emerged, with rocks lined up along their coasts, looking very much like the fossil remains of creatures that were too large to exist naturally. Although the sun was still shining, the air was getting colder and colder. Perseus found himself pulling the cloak over his shoulders tighter. Those winged sandals, which once carried him effortlessly through familiar waters, now seemed to be struggling against invisible currents and opposing forces that are making flight increasingly difficult. Long before he reached the lair of the Gorgon, he had begun to see evidence of its existence. The ship was empty on the dark water, and the crew's enders were nowhere to be seen, but their sails were still unfurled, as if they had been abandoned during a routine voyage. Perseus boarded one of the ghost ships and found it full of stone statues. The sailors were caught on the spot while handling the rigging, and their faces were frozen with expressions of shock and terror. These are not relics from ancient times but recent victims. This stone is brand new and has not been affected by the weather or time. Perseus realized that the people he saw were all those who had come into contact with these organs in recent weeks or months. These organs were transformed into art at a glance, from the eyes that turned life into death into art. This discovery filled his heart with fear and determination. Fear is because it makes him understand the reality he is facing. These people were all experienced sailors, familiar with the sea and its dangers. They had no way to deal with the prey he planned to hunt. The determination, because each statue represents the deprivation of an innocent life. A family will never know what has happened to their loved ones. Perseus continued his journey with a new goal, but also felt increasingly uneasy. Ghost ships are scattered across miles of the ocean, which indicates that the influence of the snake-haired women extends far beyond their direct territory. He might encounter Medusa when he doesn't expect it and when he's not ready. The scenery here is getting more and more desolate and dangerous. The island appeared, but it was just bare rocks, distorted into an ugly appearance. The water itself seemed to have been polluted, thick and sticky, and cannot be explained in a natural way. The seabirds near this water fell from the sky and died. Their bodies sank into the depths of darkness without a trace. Finally, when the sun began to set, Perseus hoped this wouldn't be the last day of his life, and he saw it. This is a large island, but is always shrouded in mist. Its coast is lined with things that look like marble sculptures, but now he knows that they are the petrified remains of countless tourists. Here, beauty has turned into terror. Here, he either gains immortal glory or joins the ranks of the stone statues and becomes the decoration of the monster's lair. Perseus landed on a small island a few miles away from the Gorgon fortress. He needed time to mentally and tactically prepare for what was to come. He was obsessed with checking his equipment. The mirror shield enables him to see Medusa without having to look at her directly. The diamond sword can cut anything. The invisible hat can keep him from being seen by other snake-haired female monsters. Everything was ready except Perseus himself. He's going to try something that no hero has ever accomplished. The weapon he carried had never been tested against such an enemy. He was young and had no practical combat experience, far away from any help or support. And he was also the son of Zeus, trained by Athena and equipped with tools forged by the gods. If there is anyone who can complete this impossible task, it is him. When darkness enveloped the pitch-black sea, Perseus was preparing for his last approach to the small island, where three sisters were waiting in their kingdom of stones and shadows, unaware that their long exile was about to come to an abrupt and fierce end. The pursuit is about to turn into a confrontation. In any case, dawn will bring to an end this story that began with crime in a temple and ended with blood on the beach at the edge of the world. The gloomy dawn fell upon the island of Gorgons, silent and still, through the seemingly never-dissipating mist and the clouds fluttering against the wind. Perseus hid at an observation post several miles away, watching the sun struggle through the unnatural atmosphere surrounding his target. Even the light seemed not to dare to touch the cursed coast. He stayed up all night preparing, checking his equipment over and over again, rehearsing his methods, and trying to quell the fear that threatened his determination. This is not pure fear of war, where adrenaline can be directed into action, but rather a cold fear of approaching something that violates all natural laws and human understanding. This plan is conceptually simple, but its implementation is extremely complicated. Perseus would approach the lair of the Gorgon with an invisible hat without being detected. He would find Medusa among her sisters and observe her with a mirror shield instead of making direct eye contact. When the time is ripe, he will use that hard steel sword to cut off her head with one stroke. His magical bag can safely hold his head, allowing him to escape before Theo and Uriel react to their sister's death. It's very simple. Every aspect of the plan requires perfect timing, perfect execution, and a lot of luck. At a moment of mistake, hesitation, or clumsiness, Perseus will join the stone army that decorates the Golden Island. As morning passed, Perseus observed the island through the bronze telescope provided by Hermes, studied the terrain, and attempted to understand the layout of his target. What he saw was both more and less than he had expected. This island is larger than it looks from a distance, about 10 miles wide and 5 miles wide, that most of them are barren wastelands, twisted rock strata and dead soil without vegetation. The only place showing signs of human habitation is a valley near the center of the island, where there are high cliffs and can only be accessed through a narrow passage. The Dorgens settled down in this valley. Here, Perseus saw evidence of their cursed existence. The valley was filled with stone statues everywhere, like a terrifying garden. Hundreds of statues froze at the last moment of their lives. The soldier raised his weapon, the sailor held the rope and rigging tightly, and the traveler stretched out his hands, making a gesture of peace or prayer. Each statue tells a story of a shortened life due to an accidental glimpse of death. And what moves between these stone tablets are the organs themselves. When Perseus first saw them through the telescope, he was so shocked that he almost threw the instrument down. He was completely wrong about their appearance, their way of behaving, and their existence. He was completely unprepared for all of this. They are obviously female in appearance, but women have become something that violates all the laws of nature. Their hair was entwined like the lives of snakes, and there were hundreds of snakes where human hair should be. Their skin was covered with scales, like that of reptiles, shimmering with a greasy luster and reflecting a disgusting light. They walk in a smooth and elegant posture, both beautiful and terrifying, with their bronze wings folding and unfolding among their stone victims. But what really disturbed him was their faces. Even through telescopes and mirror shields, Perseus could see that they had retained enough human features for people to recognize what they once looked like. They are not alien monsters but transformed women. They remember humans, although they represent the opposite side of humanity. Perseus spent several hours observing their every move, trying to distinguish them and determine who Medusa was. Ancient records told him that she was immortal, while her sisters were immortal. But from a distance, all three of them looked equally terrifying and equally dangerous. Finally, as the afternoon passed, he noticed a subtle change in their behavior. Two of the snake-haired female monsters seemed to be more aggressive and more alert to potential threats. They patrolled around the valley, inspecting the roads and undoubtedly checking if there were any newly added statues in their statue collection. The third person was closer to the center of the valley and moved more slowly. Her posture showed sadness rather than anger. Perseus realized that this must be Medusa. While her sisters adapted to their terrifying lives with a fierce aggressiveness, she retained some of her original nature, a melancholy of a person who remembers what she has lost. This realization made him very disturbed, although he was reluctant to admit it. It is easier to kill a monster than a person who is still essentially human, even though her appearance has changed. But Perseus gave up these thoughts. He has gone too far and taken too many risks. We can't let emotions affect what we need. As night fell, Perseus made his final preparations. He took off his invisibility cap, tied the mirror shield to his arm and drew the rock-solid sword. The magic bag hung beside him, ready to accept its grisly bear prize. He has made all the preparations that an ordinary person can do. The few minutes it took to fly to the island were the longest in Perseus' life. Even if he was invisible, he still felt exposed and vulnerable. The snake-haired female monster might not be able to see him, but they have other senses to detect his presence. He flew very high, approached from an unexpected angle, and landed quietly on the cliff above the valley. From this advantageous position, he could overlook the territory of the snake-haired female monsters and observe their activities at night. Stano and Deliari were getting ready to spend the night. They arranged themselves among the stone carvings like guardians of the group. Medusa left her sisters and sat alone on a rock exposed above the ground, gazing at the sea. Her posture carried a profound sadness. Perseus realized that she seemed to be waiting for something that would never come, hoping for a rescue or redemption that could never be reached. He hesitated for a moment, thinking of the tragedy of what he was about to do. But that moment passed. Perseus began to walk into the valley, moving carefully so as not to disturb even the tiniest pebbles. The invisible hat blocked his ear, but it couldn't mask the sound, nor could it completely eliminate his presence. If he bumps into the statue or steps on loose rocks, the noise will alert all 3G organs of his presence. The journey down to the valley took nearly an hour. Perseus had to stop frequently, waiting for his sisters to shift their gaze away or to a different position. On several occasions, he walked to a place within the reach of Stano or Yuri, so close that he could see the scales on their skin and hear the soft hissing of their serpentine fur. Finally, he arrived at the outcast of the rock where Medusa was sitting alone. She looks more miserable up close than from a distance. Her hideous facial features could not completely hide the remnants of the beauty she once had, that facial structure that made her famous throughout the ancient world. Perseus stood behind her, raised his mirror shield to observe her reflection, and lifted the hard steel sword. He has only one chance to do this right. This sword must cut off her neck in one go, otherwise her dying scream will alarm her sisters and turn his mission into a 3-way baffle. He will never win. He could clearly see Medusa's face on the polished surface of the shield, and he saw that it always prevented him from completing the mission. She was not the roaring monster he had expected, but a woman trapped inside a monster's body. Her expression was filled with deep sadness, as if it contained all the pain in the world. But Perseus was a hero. He was trained to put responsibility above emotion and mission above kindness. With a swift and resolute wave, he thrust the steel minus-like sword at Medusa's neck. The blade pierced through the flesh and bones like water. Medusa's head immediately separated from her body. Her serpentine hair was still twisting, and blood gushed out from her severed neck. Perseus didn't look at it directly. Instead, he tucked its head into the magic bag, blocking the gaze that could turn meat into stone. But Medusa's death was not silent. The impact of the sword caused a tremor among the rocks exposed above the ground, and the sound of her headless body hitting the ground reverberated in the valley like thunder. Theo and Yuri immediately became alert. As they were searching for the source of the commotion, their heads started to spin rapidly. When they saw their sister's headless body, they let out angry and sad screams, as if they were about to shake the foundation of the island. Perseus had already begun to act. The winged sandals carried him up the valley and out of it, while the two immortal fairies flew into the air to chase after him. They couldn't see him, but they could track his movements by the chaos he made in the air and the sound of his sandals' wings. The chase that followed was a nightmare of speed and despair. Theo and Yuri Ollie flew faster than Perseus had imagined. Their bronze wings sliced through the air like blades. They screamed, piercing and threatening. Their voices clearly crossed the water surface. Perseus fled towards the edge of their territory, but getting a head start and winged sandals are already enough. When Perseus crossed the boundary of the dark waters around the Gorgon Island, he felt the pursuit relax. The sisters could not follow him into the broader Mediterranean without giving up their kingdom and their sisters' bodies. Perseus gained his freedom, won, and was still alive. He accomplished the impossible task and received a bonus that could ensure his mother's safety and his own reputation. Medusa's head was safely placed in a magic bag, and its power was waiting to be released to his enemies. But when he flew away from the island of the serpent, Perseus found that the taste of victory was not so much glory as ashes. He killed a monster, yes, but he also killed a woman who had never hurt him, a woman who didn't turn into a monster because of her own fault. On the dark island behind him, two immortal sisters were mourning the death of their mortal brother. The ancient world lost one of the most terrifying and tragic figures. Medusa is dead, but her story is far from over. Perseus' head will become a weapon with incredible power, and the creatures and legends born from her death will last longer than the civilization that created them. Death seemed to be just another transformation of this woman. She had completely changed and was hardly like the person she used to be. In Greek mythology, death is seldom the end of a story, but often the most dramatic transformation. The same is true of Medusa. Her death became the beginning of a new and wonderful life. When Perseus flew away from the island of the Gorgon with his terrifying spoils, the severed corpse he left behind had already given birth to some creatures that would reshape the myths of the ancient world. Medusa's blood was spilled on the rocky ground of the cursed island, from where two creatures emerged that embodied different aspects of the power and beauty of the gods. The first one is Pegasus, whose name has become synonymous with poetry, inspiration, and the soaring of human imagination. The second one is Chris, or a huge warrior. His golden sword will make him a figure that is both ominous, inspiring, and terrifying. The birth of these creatures was not a natural reproduction but a creation by God, the result of Medusa's unique nature and the environment in which she died. Before she became Athena's priestess, she had always been favored by the sea god Poseidon, who left his mark on her. Therefore, the children born of the herd Eth were descendants of Poseidon. They were conceived in violence, but were made from the mixture of divine blood and the soil of mortals. Pegasus was the first to appear. He spread his white wings and took his first breath of the air of the mortal world. He has a well-minus proportioned figure and is an extremely beautiful and elegant creature. His bronze-minus-colored body shines like polished marble, and his wings span twice the length of his body. But he's not merely a beautiful animal. Pegasus is the embodiment of inspiration and physical manifestation of creativity. It drives poets and artists to transcend the mundane and move towards detachment. The ancient Greeks understood that inspiration was not a gentle gift, but a wild force that could inspire or destroy those who encountered it. Pegasus reflects this duality. He is gentle and refined, with a grand and imposing presence. But he is not something that ordinary people can tame. Only heroes of both virtue and talent have the hope of riding on him. Even they do so only when they ride him for a greater purpose. Chris Ill's appearance was even more violent and dramatic. Pegasus merely emerged from his mother's blood, just as if he had come out of a sacred womb. Chris L suddenly appeared, fully armed, ready for battle. His name means golden sword, and he has been carrying this weapon since the moment he was born. The inner radiance of this sword is dazzling, and it can pierce through any armor or shield. Pegasus is renowned for its beauty and its connection with the art of peace, while Crick has been a warrior since the very first moment of his existence. He is as tall as a giant and as strong as a titan, brimming with sacred wrath that can flatten mountains and change the direction of rivers. He is the embodiment of Poseidon's revenge, found's wrath at the fate of his beloved priestess, endowed her with physical form and a terrifying purpose. The birth of these two creatures from Medusa's body is both a proof and a tragedy. It turns out that she is not the evil monster shaped by her transformation, but a woman who harbors the seeds of beauty and strength. Her children are all very beautiful and sacred, and have not been affected by the curse that made her look so terrifying. But this also means that her death was necessary for their birth. Medusa has the ability to take lives, but she cannot give them back. The curse that made her gaze fatal also prevented her from experiencing the joy of being a mother for the rest of her life. Only in death can she realize the most fundamental aspect of her nature. This irony is bitter and profound. Medusa, who was punished as a victim of sexual violence, could only become a mother through her own violent death. The priestess who devoted herself to serving the virgin goddess discovered that her only legacy was the children born of blood and earth, not love and choice. The first thing Pegasus did after his birth was to fly from the cursed island to heaven, as if he wanted to escape the tragedy of his birth. His wings carried him to draw a huge arc over the Mediterranean Sea. Wherever he passed, his appearance seemed to purify the malicious influences in the air. The sailors who saw him fly overhead reported that the storm had subsided and The wind direction had turned favorable, and their ship was heading towards its destination at supernatural speed. His Pegasus finally arrived at Mount Heliland, the sacred mountain of the NUSES, where his hooves tapped against the rocks, creating the hippos, Sirodi of spring. This spring is called the spring of poetic inspiration. Its water is sought after by writers and artists who hope to drink from the same source that has given birth to the greatest literary and artistic works. But Pegasus is no ordinary mount. Any writer who wants to tame it can do so. He maintains his wildness and freedom, only appearing before those heroes who pursue goals higher than personal honor. Among them, the most famous one is Bellerophon, who rides Pegasus to fight against the Chimera, another monster born of the mating of the gods and the curse of the gods. The road in Isla is darker and more complicated. Pegasus symbolizes the inspiring side of sacred power, while Chrysler represents terrifying justice. He became the giant of giants, a warrior. His appearance on the battlefield could reverse the conflicts between countries. It is said that his golden sword was burning with the light of the sun. As long as the army saw it shining on the horizon, they would flee. Unlike his brother with wings, Chris Eyre does not seek solitude or artistic pursuits. He directly participates in human affairs and emerges at critical moments, disrupting the balance between justice and injustice. He became a legendary figure among warriors, a sacred champion who could not be defeated by the weapons of mortals or the strategies of the mundane world. Some records indicate that Chrysler eventually settled in the distant west, where he established a kingdom of giants and ruled with wisdom and terrifying power. Others claim that he has never died, but has continued to wander around the earth, showing up whenever tyranny threatens to overwhelm justice and innocent people, yet a fighter beyond the capabilities of ordinary people. The two creatures born from Medusa's death also complicate the narratives surrounding her transformation and death. If she was truly just a monster, how could her death give birth to such a great creature? If she is completely evil, then how could Pegasus, the embodiment of artistic inspiration and beauty, emerge from her blood? The ancient Greeks understood this contradiction and used it to a depth to their myths. The story of Medusa is not only a heroic tale of killing monsters, but also a complex reflection on the essence of justice, transformation and redemption. Her death was both a tragedy and a victory, an end and a beginning. Perseus left the scene of his victory, not realizing that a miracle had come into being after his departure. He put Medusa's head in a magic container, not knowing that he had also unintentionally brought new deities into this world. His heroic act brought about consequences that he could neither understand nor have imagined. The head itself retains all lethal power, even in the midst of death. The magic bag containing it became heavier than its actual weight, as if the severed head still had consciousness and could undergo terrifying changes just like Medusa did when she was cursed. Perseus found himself flying more slowly, not because of fatigue, but because he was burdened with a supernatural load. When Perseus returned to the civilized world, he began to understand that killing Medusa did not end her story, but made it even more complicated, and it has a wide influence. The head he possessed was not merely a trophy, but a weapon with incredible power. The blood flowing from her severed neck had already begun to reshape the mythological landscape of the ancient world. Behind him, on the cursed island, I know and Yuri mourned their sister's death, while marveling at the creatures that had emerged from the island. For the first time since their transformation, they felt something beyond anger and despair. The birth of Pegasus and Chris Eyre indicates that their suffering may have a greater purpose, and even the sacred cruelty sometimes gives rise to sacred beauty. Medusa is dead, but her legacy has only just begun. The head carried by Perseus later became one of the most powerful weapons in Greek mythology, used to defeat monsters and tyrants, protect the innocent and punish criminals. The children born after her death have inspired countless stories about heroism, art and sacred justice. At the beginning of her story, this priestess was a victim of God's violence, but by the end, she had become the mother of legends, a source of power that lived longer than the civilization that created them. Theft did not diminish her significance. Instead, it transformed it into something eternal and magnificent. Her story is far from over. Death did not weaken Medusa's power. Instead, it concentrated it, refined it, and made it easy to carry. The severed head that Perseus carried with her retained all the terrifying abilities that made her the most terrifying creature in the ancient world. But now these abilities served heroes rather than the isolation of cursed exiles. On Perseus' way home from the island of the Gorgon, the sustained effect of the head was tested for the first time. When he flew over the unfamiliar waters of the distant western Mediterranean, he encountered the Cedos, a huge sea monster that had been causing terror along the coast of Ethiopia. This thing was huge. Its snake-like body stretched for hundreds of yards in the dark water, and its head emerged above the sea surface, like a living mountain with teeth. For months, Cedos has been trampling on the coastline, destroying ships, devouring crew members and making maritime trade impossible. This creature is so huge and powerful that conventional weapons are of no use to it. The army once tried to drive it away with a barrage of spears and arrows, but this attack was like raindrops hitting the mountainside. Perseus was exhausted from the battle with Gorgons. Eager to test his newly acquired weapon, he walked towards the monster. From a safe distance, he took Medusa's head out of the protective container, so that it could see the face of the dead snake-haired female monster. The effect is instantaneous and absolute. While the cedar was surfacing to attack what it thought was another small flying creature, it suddenly stopped moving completely. Its huge body, which used to cut through the water surface smoothly in the water, has now become as still and solid as granite. The sea monster has transformed into a stone island, and its petrified form has created a new landmark that will be familiar to generations of sailors. This transformation was so thorough that even the water surrounding the cedar turned into stone, forming a rough solid lithosphere in what was originally a liquid ocean. The fish swimming near the monster were captured by the petrification effect and became fossil decorations embedded in the newly formed stone strata. Perseus was astonished by the power of the weapon, but also disturbed by its excessive killing and wounding nature. Its head not only turned the target monster into stone, but also turned everything around it into stone. He realized that waving Medusa's head required extra caution and precision. This is not a sword that can be drawn at will or used in close combat without endangering the safety of allies and innocent onlookers. The incident with Cedos also taught Perseus some important knowledge about the psychology of his weapons. The head not only retains Medusa's fatal gaze, but also her consciousness. When he held it, he could sense an existence inside, a consciousness that was both strange and familiar. It was as if Medusa's soul was trapped in her severed head, aware of what was happening around her, but powerless to communicate or control her environment. Perseus was aware of this, for though he was reluctant to admit it, he felt extremely uneasy. He thought that killing Medusa would end her suffering. Yet death seemed to have nearly turned her pain into another form of imprisonment. She is now forced to become someone else's weapon, and her lethal gaze is used for purposes she may not approve of. Her consciousness was trapped in a head that could never rest in peace. Perseus continued his journey home and encountered other opportunities to test his weapon capabilities. When he exposed his head, all the pirates who had tried to rob him turned to stone. A gang of robbers attacked him on a remote island, turning it into a frozen and invasive sculpture garden. Each time this weapon was used, it was very effective, but Perseus found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the ease of these victories. Using a Medusa head requires no skills at all. Without the test of courage, strength and wisdom, the weapon was so powerful that it made him invincible, but it also made him feel that to some extent he was cheating, achieving victory through sacred power rather than heroic virtue. The mind is prone to solving problems and neglects challenges and growth, which should be an important part of a hero's journey. What's more troublesome is that this weapon has affected his relationship with others. Perseus' new ability spread rapidly through a network of travelers, merchants and sailors, who spread the news throughout the ancient world. People began to treat him in different ways, mixed with fear, making normal interpersonal communication impossible. When Perseus stopped at the port to replenish supplies or rest, he found that the entire community would be deserted because of his arrival. Shopkeepers would rather keep their food and supplies outside than risk face-to-face contact. Children will be driven indoors by their parents because they are worried that even if they get close to people carrying such weapons, they will somehow attract its lethal power. The loneliness Perseus was in was different from that Medusa suffered during her exile, but in any case, it was loneliness. He was cut off from normal human society by a weapon that should have ensured his status as a famous hero. That head that endowed him with incredible power also indicated that he was a person too dangerous to be casually associated with. Perseus began to have a slight understanding of Medusa's life during her exile, unable to maintain normal interpersonal relationships, constantly realizing that his presence brings fear rather than comfort, and realizing that he is fundamentally separated from the human society he is supposed to protect. All these burdens now fall on his shoulders. But unlike Medusa, Perseus chose this burden. Theoretically, he could have his head removed and resume a normal life. The fact that he chose not to do so and continued to carry and use weapons regardless of the psychological cost reveals the essence of power and an important aspect of the choices made by heroes. When Perseus finally returned to Serapis and faced Polites, Medusa's head was given the most important use. Polites was the king who initially manipulated him to carry out this mission. Perseus discovered that while he was away, Polites did indeed use threats and political pressure to force his mother Dil to marry in order to overcome her resistance. The confrontation between Perseus and Polyxt was not a battle but an execution. Perseus entered the palace at the banquet celebrating the king's wedding, stood before the gathered court, and merely lifted Medusa's head. Polites and his supporters immediately turned to stone, and their expressions of shock and fear were forever preserved in the cold marble. In this situation, using weapons is like justice to Perseus. The actions of these people lack honor, threaten their families, and violate the most fundamental principles of hospitality and dignity. It seems that their turning into stones is an appropriate punishment for their hard-hearted behavior. But the easy victory also troubled him. Polites had no chance to repent, no chance to show mercy or atone for his sins, no dramatic confrontation. Virtue triumphed through struggle and sacrifice. The Forer ended the conflict in an instant, eliminating all the complexity and reducing a political crisis to a supernatural execution. Perseus began to realize that Medusa's head was not only a weapon, but also a responsibility that would affect the rest of his life. He cannot use it casually or carelessly, nor can he give it up without letting it fall into the wrong hands. He is closely connected to it, just as it is closely connected to him. He is determined to bear its strength and psychological burden until he finds a safe way to deal with it. This head, which once belonged to a woman punished for the violence of the gods, has now become a symbol of ultimate power and ultimate responsibility. After her death, Medusa continued to taint the lives of those who met her, compelling them to strive to address issues of justice, kindness, and the proper use of overwhelming force. Her gaze still turned flesh into stone, but now it has also transformed heroes into something more complex and morally ambiguous, rather than the simple defenders of virtue they originally intended to be. There are few characters in ancient mythology as enduring and adaptable as Medusa. Her story has been retold, reimagined and reinterpreted in 3,000 years of human culture. Each generation finds new meanings in the stories of the beautiful priestess who turns into a monster and the monster that becomes a symbol. The ancient Greeks themselves were not content with a single version of the Medusa story. Even in ancient times, her myth had many variations, each emphasizing different aspects of her transformation and birth. Some versions depict her as an ancient demon that has always existed and threatened the lives of mortals. Others, especially those who came later, began to emphasize that she was a victim of God's injustice. Even in the classical period, the visual representation of Medusa underwent significant changes. Early depictions indicated that she was a true monster. Her face was more like that of a beast than a woman, her teeth were long rather than teeth, and her hair was clearly serpentine rather than human. These images are intended to stir up fear and aversion, serving as a warning of the consequences of dissatisfaction with God. But as Greek art became more complex and psychologically complex, Medusa's expression began to change. Artists began to depict her with recognizable human features, which were beautiful even when distorted. The snake in her hair became more elegant and decorative, rather than terrifying. Although her face was still lifeless, it revealed sadness and tragedy rather than pure malice. This evolution of artistic expression reflects the deepening understanding of Medusa by people who regard her as a tragic figure rather than a simple monster. The Greeks had a complex understanding of fate, justice, and the capriciousnesses of the gods. They began to see in her story their own anxiety about the arbitrary punishment of the gods and the vulnerability of mortals in the face of forces beyond their control. Roman culture inherited the Greeks' infatuation with Medusa, but transformed it according to its own values and concerns. Roman artists and writers were not very interested in the theological implications of her story, but were more concerned with its political and military applications. Medusa's head became a symbol of protective power used on shields, armor, and public buildings to resist the influence of enemies and evil. The Romans also began to explore the psychological aspects of the Medusa story, while the Greeks merely hinted at this. Roman poets like I depicted her transformation with clear sympathy, portraying her as an innocent victim of sacred politics, rather than a sinner who was just punished. This interpretation had an influence on later European literature and art. During the Middle Ages, the story of Medusa underwent another major transformation. Christian interpreters, disturbed by the polytheistic elements in Greek mythology, but also attracted by their symbolic potential, began to interpret her story as an allegory about the danger of vanity, the fall of beauty, and the necessity of divine judgment. Medieval artists often depicted Medusa in the context of religious art, using her image to represent sin, temptation, or the fall of human nature. Her snake-shaped hair was interpreted as a symbol of the devil's influence, and her fatal gaze became a metaphor for the spiritual death caused by turning away from God. But even in the context of Christianity, more compassionate interpretations emerged during the Renaissance. Some medieval writers began to suggest that Medusa's transformation was not entirely just. She represented the tragic consequences of living in a fallen world where innocence could not resist suffering. The Renaissance reignited people's interest in classical mythology and led to a more detailed understanding of its psychological and artistic possibilities. Renaissance artists such as Caravaggio and C.R. created an astonishing performance of Medusa, emphasizing her beauty and horror, her humanity and her monster. Leonardo da Vinci painted a lost work depicting the head of Medusa. It is said to be so lifelike and terrifying that the audience would back off as if they were seeing the real Golgi. This painting represents a new understanding of the power of art to evoke psychological responses, making myths feel direct and personal rather than distant and abstract. During the Renaissance, writers began to explore the story of Medusa as a metaphor for the relationship between artists and beauty and horror, creation and destruction. In her story, they saw the works they had painstakingly created themselves, which were both beautiful and meaningful, inspiring and disturbing, changing the audience while remaining true to their own artistic vision. The Romantic periods of the 18th and 19th centuries once again changed people's understanding of the Medusa story. Romantic poets and artists were fascinated by themes of isolation, estrangement, and tragic heroes. They found a perfect symbol in Medusa to express their concern for art and existence. I wrote a poem titled On Leonardo da Vinci's Medusa, depicting her as a tragic beauty. However, it is not so much fear as elegance, which can turn the soul of the viewer into stone. This explanation highlights Medusa's humanity. Although she turned into a monster, her tragedy does not lie in becoming a monster, but in being regarded as one. Psychological explanations of the Medusa story also emerged in the 19th century. Early psychologists and anthropologists began to analyze her story, believing that it reflected deeply rooted human fears and desires, especially those related to female sexual behavior, maternal power, and the fear of castration or castration. These explanations had an impact on the thought of the 20th century, especially the works of Sigmund Freud, who believed that Medusa's head was a symbol of the female genitalia and the resulting male fear. Although Freud's specific explanations have been largely rejected by contemporary scholars, his insights into Medusa's story, which reflect deep mind-seated psychological anxiety, still hold significant influence. New interpretations and adaptations of the Medusa story emerged in the 20th century. Feminist scholars began to examine her account, interpreting it as a story about women being victimized and how patriarchal society turned female victims into scapegoats and monsters. Writers like Alan Southers believe that Medusa represents the power of female creativity, and her story has been distorted by a male-dominated culture, suppressing and demonizing the power of women. In this interpretation, Perseus is not a hero, but an agent of patriarchal oppression. Medusa is not a monster, but a powerful woman who has been demonized for refusing to submit to male authority. Contemporary art has embraced this reinterpretation. The works created by artists depict Medusa as a beautiful, powerful and tragic figure rather than a monster. These modern works often emphasize that her serpentine hair is a crown rather than a curse. Her gaze was a penetrating wisdom, not a fatal force. Popular culture has also embraced Medusa, although it usually spreads out her complex myths into simple horror or action-adventure stories. Movies, TV shows and video games often feature Medusa-like creatures as the opponents defeated by the heroic protagonists, but these adaptations rarely explore the deeper psychological and social implications of her story. Perhaps most importantly, Medusa has become a symbol of the survival and transformation of contemporary women, especially those who have experienced sexual violence or other forms of trauma. From jewelry to tattoos and protest slogans, her image is everywhere, representing the power to transform victims into strength, pain into wisdom, and vulnerability into protective power. This modern interpretation of Medusa is completely contrary to the ancient understanding of her story. The Greeks regarded her as a cautionary tale about the justice of the gods and the consequences of overstepping boundaries, while contemporary culture often sees her as an inspiring figure representing resilience, transformation, and the power to reclaim one's own narrative from those who define it. The evolution of Medusa's story over 3,000 years of human culture reveals the important ways in which myths function in human society. These ancient stories are not fixed text but living narratives that each generation uses to express their concerns, fears and wishes. Medusa's enduring power does not lie in any interpretation of her story, but in her ability to tell the fundamental experiences of humanity: the fear of change, the pursuit of justice, the struggle for autocratic power, and the longing to find meaning in suffering. Her story continues to resonate as it raises questions that every human culture must confront. In our time, as we strive to address issues of sexual violence, institutional injustice and abuse of power, Medusa's story is more meaningful than ever. She remains consistent, like a mirror in which we see our own fears, hopes and struggles reflected in us in the form of myth. The priestess turned into a monster, the victim became a weapon, and the woman became a symbol. Medusa's transformation continues, as each generation has found in her story the most powerful meaning that illustrates their own historical moments. In the 20th and 21st centuries, people have conducted a revolutionary examination of the story of Medusa, fundamentally challenging traditional interpretations and revealing layers of meanings that previous generations either failed to see or chose to ignore. The core of this reinterpretation is a simple yet profound question: what if Medusa had never been the villain in her own story? Since the 1970s, feminist scholars have begun to interpret Greek mythology from a different perspective, which is highly sensitive to the way ancient patriarchal societies constructed narratives, a narrative approach aimed at proving and perpetuating male dominance. In the story of Medusa, they found that it was not a tale of heroism defeating a monster, but rather a deeply disturbing one, depicting how a woman who was hurt by a powerful man was blamed, punished, and ultimately destroyed because of her own harm. The key insight that changed the academic community's understanding of Medusa was the recognition that her transformation into a monster was not merely a punishment for illegal acts, but a secondary injury to the original crime she committed. Poseidon's attack on Medusa at the Temple of Athena was not merely sexual violence, but also an infringement upon the most sacred space of Athens, an infringement upon a woman who had served the gods all her life. Athena's response to this crime reveals the distorted logic of victim-blaming that feminists believe still exists in contemporary society. Athena did not punish Poseidon for invading her temple and her priestess, but chose to punish Medusa because she allowed herself to be violated. The goddess's reasoning was that Medusa's appearance during the attack polluted the sacred space and shifted the responsibility for the crime onto the victim rather than the perpetrator. This interpretation has changed the entire moral framework of the Medusa story. Perseus was not a hero who killed monsters, but a to love patriarchal oppression. He accomplished the destruction of a woman who had already been crushed by the injustice of the gods. His pursuit is driven by arrogance rather than noble purposes, which indicates that men's self-awareness and social expectations induct men to commit violence against women who pose no actual threat to them. The reinterpretation of feminism also examines the symbolic meaning of Medusa's transformation itself. Her serpentine hair, traditionally regarded as a symbol of her monster-like nature, could be understood as a sign of female strength and wisdom. In many ancient cultures, snakes were associated with female deities, fertility and sacred knowledge. Athena's transformation of Medusa's hair into a snake might not represent demonization, but rather the goddess's unconscious recognition of the true power of her priestess. The fatal gaze that frightened Medusa so much has taken on a new meaning here. It is not a curse but a form of protection. For a woman who was completely crushed by those institutions that were supposed to protect her safety, this might be the only protection. Her ability to turn others into stones can be interpreted as a metaphor. That is, trauma can cause emotional disorders, keep others at a distance, or symbolize the power to refuse to be a victim again. In her article Medusa's Smile, French feminist theorist Ellen X gave a highly influential description of Medusa, arguing that the Gorgon represents the suppressed power of female creativity and sexual desire. Sykes believes that patriarchal culture deliberately created the myth of Medusa's terrifying appearance to prevent both men and women from recognizing the true source of female power. You just need to look Medusa straight in the eye to see her, 6xcs wrote. And she's not fatal. She's very beautiful and she's smiling. This explanation completely overturns the traditional understanding of Medusa's story, believing that the same miners called monsters she describes are lies fabricated by those who fear her true nature. Contemporary feminist artists had embraced this reinterpretation and created works depicting Medusa as beautiful, powerful and sacred, rather than a monster. These manifestations often emphasize that her serpentine hair is a crown of wisdom, rather than a sign of curse, and her gaze is a penetrating insight, rather than a lethal force. Medusa's feminist revival was also welcomed by survivors of sexual violence, who saw their own experiences of institutional betrayal and victim accusation in her story. The Tag Tajameta movement often uses the image of Medusa to represent the power to speak the truth about sexual assault, even if this truth is uncomfortable or threatens to establish a power structure. This contemporary interpretation indicates that Medusa's ability to turn others into stone represents the discomfort felt by those in power when facing the reality of sexual violence. Her gaze forces the audience to confront the truth they would rather ignore, resulting in a rigid symbol of paralysis that often accompanies such confrontation. However, the feminist reinterpretation of Medusa's story is not without its complexity and controversy. Some scholars believe that interpreting ancient myths through contemporary political frameworks may distort their original cultural meanings and impose modern concepts on societies that understand gender, power and justice in fundamentally different ways. Critics also point out that although the feminist interpretation offers a more compassionate interpretation of Medusa's character, it may actually weaken her power, transforming her from a truly terrifying and supernatural figure into a victim, and her monster is merely a social construct. A narrative that acknowledges the reality of women's anger and power is meaningful, even if the form of such power makes society feel uneasy or threatened. The question of whether Medusa should be understood as a victim or a monster has also raised a broader question: how should we interpret mythological figures who are both tragic and possessed terrifying qualities? The ancient Greeks favored characters who were both sympathetic and dangerous, beautiful and terrifying, innocent and guilty. Contemporary interpretations sometimes struggle with this complexity and tend to more clearly divide the narrative into categories of the oppressor and the oppressed. Perhaps the most effective way to understand Medusa's story is to recognize that it can support multiple interpretations simultaneously. She can be interpreted as a victim of God's injustice, or as a powerful figure beyond simple classification. Her transformation represents both the terrifying consequences of trauma and the potential of trauma to turn into a source of strength and protection. Feminists' reinterpretation of Medusa undoubtedly enriches our understanding of her story and reveals the dimensions of meaning that previous generations had overlooked or suppressed. But it also raises important questions about the relationship between mythological interpretation and political activism, as well as between academic research and contemporary social concerns. It is obvious that Medusa's story continues to have a strong impact on contemporary audiences precisely because it addresses the still pressing and unresolved issues in our own society. The questions raised in her account about justice, power, accusations against victims, and the transformation of trauma into strength are as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. Whether we interpret her as a victim or a monster, a symbol or an individual, an ancient myth or a contemporary metaphor, Medusa is always her, a figure who forces us to confront the disturbing truths of the world we live in, and the story we tell ourselves about justice, power, and how to treat those who are different or threatening. Her gaze still had a fixed force, that perhaps it is not the flesh that turns into stone, but rather those comfortable assumptions that enable us to avoid struggling with the complexity of human experience and the persistent systemic injustice. Although the story of Medusa mainly exists in the fields of myth and literary interpretation, archaeologists and historians had discovered fascinating evidence of how her image and narrative played a role in the actual daily life of ancient Mediterranean culture. These findings not only provide an important backdrop for understanding the story itself, but also for understanding the society that has been created and preserved for centuries. The earliest image of Medusa can be traced back to the 7th century. This scene appeared on pottery, coins, and architectural decorations in the Greek world. These early images are completely different from the more humanized versions that came later. They showed a real monster with protruding eyes, a protruding tongue, and hair that was clearly made up of twisting snakes rather than human hair. Archaeological evidence indicates that these early Medusa images mainly had the function of an apotropoesis. They do it to ward off evil spirits and protect the spaces or items they decorate. Her image appears on the shields held by warriors, on the walls of homes and temples, as well as on everyday items such as cups and jewels. The ancient Greeks believed that Medusa's terrifying appearance could scare away evil spirits, enemy troops, and bad luck. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to Medusa is the excavation of the Temple of Artemis on Corfu, which dates back to around 590 BC. The huge gable of the temple features the central image of Medusa, flanked by her children, Aegisthus and Chryse, all of which are depicted in limestone reliefs and still retain the traces of their original vivid colors. The decoration of this temple is very important because it shows Medusa in a background that emphasizes her maternal nature rather than her pure monster nature. She is depicted as a powerful protective figure, guarding the sacred space. Her terrifying appearance served a protective rather than threatening role. The appearance of her children in the scene reinforces the interpretation of Medusa, a complex character who embodies both destructive and creative power. During the excavation of the Temple of Athena and the Acropolis of Athens, many artifacts related to Medusa were discovered, including small bronze statues that might have been sacrifices and pottery shards decorated with scenes of Perseus' exploration. Interestingly, some of the artifacts show that Athena herself held or displayed Medusa's head, suggesting that the goddess incorporated the power of her from a priestess into her own sacred arsenal. The historical statue of Athene Apotonis is a huge golden ivory sculpture that occupies the interior of the Apotonis temple. Medusa's head is clearly displayed on the goddess's eye shield, which is a protective breastplate or shield. This position is of great significance because it indicates that Medusa's power has become an integral part of Athena's own sacred authority. Archaeological evidence from all over the Mediterranean indicates that the image of Medusa has been adapted and modified by different cultures in accordance with their own artistic traditions and religious beliefs. The Atlas version of Medusa often emphasizes her more humanized qualities, depicting her with recognizable facial features and expressions to convey sadness or pain rather than pure anger. Tens of thousands of Medusa figures have been unearthed at the Roman archaeological site, ranging from large architectural sculptures to tiny jewelry pieces. The Romans were particularly fond of using her image in military contexts, adorn armors, weapons and military standards with her portrait. This indicates that they mainly regarded her as a symbol of protective power rather than an evil figure. One of the most interesting archaeological discoveries related to Medusa was found in a Roman villa in Pompeii, which was preserved by the eruption of the Vesuvius volcano in 79 AD. The mural in the villa shows that Perseus seems to be holding Medusa's head, but the artist depicted her face as beautiful rather than terrifying, with only subtle snake elements in her hair. This Pompeii mural indicates that during the Roman period, artists began to explore a more compassionate interpretation of Medusa's character, emphasizing her tragedy rather than purely terrifying aspects. The beautiful face on the severed head created an unsettling sense of tension, which might reflect the growing awareness that her story was unjust. Excavations of ancient Greek temples have also revealed the connection between Medusa's story and actual religious activities. At several sites, archaeologists discovered small clay tablets engraved with prayers or curses for the power of Medusa. These stone tablets indicate that some ancient Greeks believed they could summon her protective power for their own purposes. It is particularly interesting that in the discoveries of women's religious sites, the image of Medusa appears next to symbols related to childbirth and women's rights. This archaeological evidence supports the explanation for Medusa, who, despite having transformed into a monster, still maintained a connection with the sacred authority of women. The historical background revealed by archaeological research also helps explain why the story of Medusa emerged in such a form. Greece from the 8th to the 5th century, BC was a society that underwent rapid social and political changes, and traditional religious customs which challenged by new philosophical and artistic movements. Against this backdrop, Medusa's transformation from a priestess to a monster can be understood as reflecting her anxiety over changes in gender roles, the evolution of religious customs, and the power relationship between gods and humans. Her story might have been a way for the ancient Greeks to explore and deal with these cultural tensions in the form of myths. Archaeological evidence also indicates that the story of Perseus and Medusa was used for educational purposes in ancient Greek society. Pottery specially designed for seminars and other educational gatherings often features the scenes of their encounters, indicating that this myth is considered suitable for moral and philosophical guidance. Archaeological research shows that the image of Medusa has persisted for centuries and across different cultures, indicating that her story had a powerful influence on ancient imagination. Even with the changes in political systems and the development of religious customs, her image continued to appear on everything from grand architectural sculptures to simple household items. Perhaps most importantly, archaeological evidence shows that ancient artisans constantly reinterpreted and modified the image of Medusa, which indicates that her story was understood as a living one that could be adapted to solve contemporary problems, rather than a fixed story with only one correct interpretation. The material culture surrounding Medusa reveals a society that is deeply embroiled in issues of power, justice, change, and the relationship between beauty and terror. That image serves multiple functions simultaneously: a talisman, an artistic subject, a religious symbol, and a political metaphor. This archaeological background enriches our understanding of the Medusa story, which is not only literary or mythological, but also a living aspect of ancient culture, shaping and reflecting the daily experiences of ordinary people. The priestess who turned into a monster is not merely a character in the story, but an existence in the material world. Her image offers protection, evokes fear, and prompts people to reflect on the justice of God and the nature of human suffering. Archaeological records also reveals some interesting things about the evolution of Medusa's story over time. Early performances tended to emphasize her odd side, while later ones gradually humanized her. This indicates that the ancient attitude towards her character was not static but evolved along with the changes in cultural values and artistic emotions. This physical evidence provides crucial support for contemporary interpretations that emphasize the complexity and ambiguity of Medusa's character. The ancient Greeks themselves, as their artistic and religious practices revealed, regarded her as a figure embodying multiple and sometimes contradictory qualities: protectors and threats, victims and monsters, humans and gods. When we reach the end of our journey through Medusa's maze-like story, we find that we are not ending but beginning. Her story began in the sacred area of the Temple of Athena over 2,500 years ago and has continued to develop and transform in our own times, proving that some stories are too powerful and too important for human experience to truly end. The reason why Medusa's story has endured is not because of its simple narrative structure, but because of its profound complexity. It refuses to simply categorize good and evil, victims and villains, monsters and humans, etc. She is still the same as before. A mirror reflects our deepest fears and most difficult problems: justice, power, transformation, and the cost of being distinctive in a world that demands conformity. This young priestess, who once guarded the sacred flame of Athena with dedication and hope, has become one of the most well-known figures in world culture. Her image appears on everything from ancient Greek pottery to contemporary fashion accessories. This ubiquity is not weakened her power to disrupt and provoke. If there is any difference, it is that her persistent presence in our cultural consciousness indicates that the issues raised by her story have never been as relevant as they are now. In our own era, as we strive to address sexual violence, institutional betrayal, and the ways in which victims are blamed for the crimes committed against them, Medusa's transformation takes on a new sense of urgency and significance. Her story tells all those who have ever been punished for others' crimes, those who have been traumatized to the point where they don't even recognize themselves, and those who have discovered that the system that was supposed to protect them has instead become a source of additional harm. That Medusa's legacy is not merely a symbol of her as a victim. Her story also tells of the possibility of transformation, finding strength in powerlessness and creating meaning from pain. The snake on her head, the gaze that turned her body into stone, and the loneliness that isolated her from human society. All of this can not only be understood as punishment, but also as a form of protection, a way to ensure that she will no longer suffer the kind of violent harm that disrupted her previous life. Agassiz and Chrysler, born from the blood of her death, demonstrate that even the most devastating endings can give rise to new beauty and power. Her children embody artistic inspiration and sacred justice, which she herself lacks in her life. Proving that death is not always a failure, the stories we tell about transformation are as important as transformation itself. The hero Perseus, who killed her, used her head as a weapon and a burden. He found that great power was accompanied by great responsibility, and victory sometimes seemed more like a tragedy. His story is always intertwined with hers, reminding us that the connection between heroes and monsters is often much closer than we wish to admit. The line between justice and violence is thinner than we are willing to admit. The evolution of the Medusa image in 3,000 years of human culture demonstrates some fundamental ways in which myths function in human society. These ancient stories are not exhibits in museums, but living tales recreated by each generation to address their own concerns and challenges. The monster that once terrified the ancient Greeks has now become a source of inspiration for contemporary trauma survivors. Being accused of being a victim of sexual assault has become a symbol of resistance against the culture of victims. This shift in meaning is not a distortion of Medusa's true story, but rather a continuation of it. Mythology has always been a collaborative process, a dialogue between the past and the present, and a dialogue between the stories we inherit and the meanings we create. Medusa's narrative remains crucial as it is constantly evolving and growing, communicating with new audiences in new ways. Archaeological evidence shows that even in ancient times, different communities had different understandings of her story and adapted it for different purposes. Medusa, who protected Athenian families from evil, was different from the Medusa that decorated Roman military equipment or appeared in the religious background of women. Every culture, every generation, and every artist has found the most powerful elements in her story to express their own experiences and concerns. This diversity of meaning is not a weakness of the Medusa story, but its greatest strength. She can simultaneously represent the danger of female power and the tragedy of female victimization, the horror of transformation, as well as the possibility of transcendence, different isolations, and the protection from fear. Her gaze, which turns the living flesh into stone, can be understood as a metaphor, as trauma solidifies us in moments of pain, or as a symbol of power which can stop others from moving forward and force them to face the truth they would rather avoid. Her serpentine hair can represent the fall of natural beauty, or it can represent the wisdom brought by embracing our own wildness. Her death can symbolize the silence of a female voice, or the birth of new forms of creativity. The beauty of the Medusa story lies in its refusal to resolve these contradictions. It insists that truth is complex and that the most important questions rarely have simple answers. She embodies the fundamental ambiguity of human experience. We are all innocent and evil, beautiful and wicked, powerful and vulnerable, at the same time. In our era, as we strive to create a more just and fair society, Medusa's story offers both warnings and inspiration. Her transformation reminds us of the terrifying consequences of institutional failure. What happens when those who are supposed to protect the vulnerable instead attribute their own suffering to the vulnerable? But her patience and her persistent presence in our cultural imagination also indicate that even in the most destructive changes, finding ways to transform trauma into strength and isolation into protection is possible to survive. The priestess turned into a monster, into a symbol, and into inspiration. Medusa's transformation is still ongoing. Countless people of all kinds have found meaning in her story, but she remains the same person all along. She forces us to look, truly look at the complexity of existence, the persistence of injustice, and the strange way humanity experiences the interweaving of beauty and terror. Her gaze still had a fixed force, but perhaps what has turned into stone now is not the flesh, but complacency. It is not the body, but the assumption of comfort that keeps us from struggling with difficult facts. Look at Medusa, truly look, don't turn around in fear or disgust. What we may discover is not death, but transformation, not monsters, but all the beautiful yet terrifying complexities in human nature. The story begins with a young woman who believes that God will protect her. Eventually, she realizes that protection, justice and meaning are the things we must create for ourselves and each other. Medusa's legacy is not her monsters, but her perseverance. It is not her death, but her continued existence in the stories we tell and retell. The meaning of what we create and reshape, the transformation we experience, and the significance of helping others survive. 3,000 years after Medusa's death on a beach at the edge of the known world, her voice still echoes in our culture, reminding us that some stories are too important to truly end. Some questions are too important to be fully answered. Some numbers are so powerful that they can never be fully understood. She is a priestess. She is the victim. She is a monster. She is a mother. She is a symbol. She is a warning. She inspired me. She was, is and will always be an impossible human being. Her story, like all the best stories, has no ending, for it is still being written, still being changed by everyone who encounters it, and discovering something in it that tells of their own experiences. That is what it means to be human in a world that is both beautiful and terrifying, both just and unjust, protection and threat. For centuries, the power of Medusa's gaze has not diminished in the slightest. It still forces us to observe, to question, and to change. When we look back on her, we may discover something about our own essence. The snake in her hair was still wriggling. The problems in her story are still burning. All of us are learning how to survive our own transformation.